Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth academic forum of the Hong Kong Social Enterprise Summit. My name is Yanto Chandra. I'm associate professor at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. I'm a facilitator and a curator for this event. This year's forum will focus on certified B corporation. The idea that the purpose of a business is to serve the interests of shareholders, which later came to be known as shareholder primacy, has come under attack for a number of decades. And some critics have pointed out that business is a major contributor to a number of problems around the world, from social inequality to climate change. Yet business also plays a very big role in improving our lives, our health, creating jobs, as a source of revenue for governments to operate. There has been a numerous number of experiments taking place around the world to enhance the role of business in society. We all have heard about corporate social responsibility from about 40, 50 years ago, the bottom of the pyramid. Then we have creating shared value, stakeholder capitalism, inclusive capitalism, and regenerative economy. So in around 2006, there has been a quiet revolution started by a couple of pioneers who experimented with the idea that we could use certification as an alternative tool to provide assurance and verification for businesses that they can exist to chase profit while at the same time serving the interest of employees, customers, community, and the environment. So we call this certified B corporation or B Corp. Now this B Corp is actually a voluntary certification, and it tries to balance what came to be known as people, planet, and profit, whichever comes first. Right? Around the world, there are over 4,000 certified B corporations. However, Asia is a bit of a laggard. If we counted the number of certified B corporations in East Asia, there are only around 80 plus of them that are spread across Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. So what is this thing about certified B corporation? So it triggers a lot of questions. And there has been a number of scientific research that have been conducted by experts and have been published in major journals. And but it still leaves a lot of questions. So what we are having today is we're hoping to take stock of what we have learned in terms of the research and also practices of certified B corporation to get to know, for example, why are companies willing to get certified? When is the best time to get certified? How do you get certified? Is certification necessary at all? So today we are very blessed and privileged to have three experts on B corporations, 2 scholars and 1 practitioner. The first speaker is Professor Matthew Grimes, who is a professor of business at the University of Cambridge. He's actually one of the pioneers of B Corp who have published the topic of B Corp in a major journal. And the second speaker is Dr. Alim Beveridge, who is an assistant professor of business and management in the University of Nottingham, Ningbo in China. And last but not least, we have Ms. Ada Yip, who is a founder and CEO of Urban Spring, a company that produces and markets water refill stations, which you can find in many malls and campuses around Hong Kong. And so we will have each of them to speak around 10 to 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes, and for them to put forth the ideas about B Corp. And then, yeah, so that's what we're going to do. in this session, and then we'll end up with a Q&A with the audience. Without further ado, let's give a big applause for the three speakers. Professor Grimes, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Yanto. That was a great introduction to the B Corp certification. Just want to say hello from Cambridge. It would, of course, been wonderful to meet you all in person, but I'm also delighted that we still have this opportunity to convene around these important topics. So thank you to Yanto, Karen, and all the other organizers for having me. And I should say as well, it's a delight to be on this panel with Alim, whom I've known for some time, and also with Ada. I think it's great that we have this opportunity to bring together academics and practitioners together to reflect on these ideas and topics, because I think that both sides really have so much to offer the other around these important conversations. So I've now been studying B Corps for the last decade, really since before it was cool to study B Corps. In fact, I remember once actually giving a talk on B Corps early on in my career, and within the first 30 seconds of a very senior scholar in the field challenged me and asked, "Why are you studying these companies? Aren't these just small organizations? What's the point?" And you know, I mean, fortunately, I think at this point I no longer get that question. But I think it is still a fair question. You know, why are we studying these organizations? But also, you know, why should you consider certifying as a B Corp? When Yanto asked me to present on this panel, I did think the best way to approach this would be to share a bit with you about what the academic literature has found over the last decade regarding the strengths of the B Corp certification, and then to use this to help you potentially answer this question of why, right? Why should you consider certifying as a B Corp? Or if you're already a B Corp, perhaps why you should consider recertifying. Given the audience, my guess is that many of you might have some basic familiarity with the certified B corporations, and Yanto already gave you a little bit of information. I think Alim will probably, and Ada will probably give you further information just kind of on the basics of the process that people go through in certifying. But just so that we're all on the same page for this talk, the certification, you know, is a rather rigorous certification comparatively. And it tries to ensure that companies are engaged in responsible activities with respect to really 5 different dimensions and stakeholder groups. So, you know, the governance, workers, community, the environment, and customers. And so the certification is essentially built on an impact audit, I guess you could call it, called the B Impact Assessment, or BIA, as the acronym is typically referred to. And in order to qualify for the B Corp certification, organizations need to score essentially above an 80-point threshold out of 200. It might actually seem that this is a low threshold, but it's actually not. The amount of effort required to not only audit your business's practices, but also ensure that those practices are responsible and impactful in the way that B Lab has articulated it with this certification. This effort is quite significant, particularly if you are, I mean, really, if you're a small or a large firm, right? I mean, larger firms have to have the audits have to be extensive, but for smaller organizations who are resource constrained, this is still a significant effort as well. Beyond the BIA and the certification, there's also a very active community of organizations and leaders that have really collectively worked to champion the certification and the underlying effort across the globe. And so this context has also become a very fruitful one for researchers who are looking to study this topic of social innovation more broadly, or corporate responsibility. As we all look to understand, essentially, well, what is motivating businesses to participate in these efforts, as well as the impacts that the certification is having. So early on, when I started studying this B Corp certification, there was a growing amount of buzz surrounding the concept. So people were talking about B Corp certification as this, badge of honor. So naturally, I think as my colleagues and I began researching this space, we expected to see, this kind of natural relationship between the B Corp certification adoption on the one hand, and then organizational growth on the other, right? So we thought that when, for example, small companies adopt the certification, that their companies will benefit from things like the increased legitimacy or status in the market, that their brand would increase in value, that they would gain a competitive advantage over other similar firms, and that this would naturally increase their growth over time. But this is not really what we found, and it's also not what others have found either, unfortunately. Or, we'll go on and sort of unpack this across the next few minutes here. But collectively, the research on certified B corporations is pointing in a very different direction, and the results have really, surprised me and us, and I would guess they might surprise some of you as well. So in our first study, my colleague and I started looking at the companies that had adopted the certification to see if they were benefiting from promoting the certification, right? But as we started looking at the data, we found that essentially a sizable proportion of the companies were not even promoting the certification, even after they went through this arduous process of certifying and paying for the certification. And so we started exploring, well, why would companies become B Corps, but then essentially keep that certification hidden? And so what we found in speaking with the companies was that their motivations for becoming certified actually had less to do with, accruing additional brand value as we had expected. And instead, they were telling us that they were motivated essentially by the desire to lock in their values, right? So they saw the certification as this way to essentially act consistently with their values and identity over time. And our next study further supported this idea. So what we found was that the individuals that were most likely to pursue certification in the first place were those that were the least likely to actually benefit from the certification. And then, I guess perhaps most importantly for this conversation, this third paper there on the right, the authors basically found that small and young companies that attain the B Corp certification actually don't benefit from the certification, but in fact, they experience a short-term growth penalty. In other words, the most vulnerable companies, the ones with whom you would think would benefit the most from adopting this certification, appear to pay the biggest growth penalty. But all of this raises a puzzle, right? Why would organizations work so hard to obtain a certification that might actually prove detrimental to their growth? And are entrepreneurs and executives naive to this idea? Are they naive to the growth-related challenges that are posed by the certification? So essentially, for those of you in the room, I guess the question might be, if certification requires an investment of time and resources, but at least historically, it offers little in terms of short-term growth, well, why should you even be thinking about considering it? I'd like to offer a few reflections on this based on some other research that I've been a part of, and hopefully you'll find some of these ideas provocative. So the first point I'd like to make is that values, the things that we care about within organizations, the things that we sort of bake into our mission statements, these values are often precarious. Well, what does this mean? It means we often think that, when we set the mission of the organization, that this mission naturally just kind of flows down throughout the organization and that it shapes the values of all of the employees in the organization. But it's often not that easy, right? I mean, organizations are often very prone to experiencing something that, we often call mission drift, right? Where an organization's actions begin to diverge from their core values. So in other words, it can be sometimes hard to keep your organization's values core or central, which takes me to my second point, which is that this can be very true, I think, when you are trying to grow your organization. So growth, what does it require? Well, it often requires new resources, right? It requires new stakeholder engagement. And all of the challenges of trying to grow your organization can pull you into different directions and away from your core values. So what is it that a rigorous certification like the B Corp certification, what does this offer to these organizations? Well, I think these certifications offer a way of creating layers of governance and accountability to ensure that your organization's actions remain aligned with your organization's core values. And this is why, for example, B Lab, the organization behind the certification, is so insistent that companies are writing these ideas into their bylaws, right? Because when investors want to put resources into these companies to help them grow, the organization is essentially less inclined to drift over time and essentially even required not to drift, right? So I guess I'll conclude with this. Let me just summarize what I'm trying, my essential arguments here. So although we in this room might think that there's a natural benefit that companies might get from certifying their organizations as B Corps in terms of granting a short-term boost to their growth, this relationship is not so clear from the existing evidence. And it may be, of course, that this just needs time, right? I mean, as more people come to recognize the B Corp certification, as more companies adopt the certification, it ends up becoming more legitimate, right? This becomes a certification that people care about, and it ends up helping the company grow, therefore. Or it may be that while there is a short-term growth penalty, there might also be a long-term growth benefit, right? So over the long term, companies actually do benefit in terms of their growth. But I also want to suggest that this might not actually be a bug in the certification that we need to fix, but rather a feature of the certification, something that might be important to the very essence of what it means to be a B Corp. For too long, I think we have associated organizational growth with organizational impact. But these things are not necessarily the same, right? And so if organizations, for example, are looking to optimize on impact and not just growth, it appears to be the case that this is really where the B Corp certification is strong, right? The certification helps your organizations to authenticate and lock in your values. And it does this by raising awareness of stakeholder needs, ensuring that the associated values inside the organization are embedded into practice and locked in over time. So just to come back around to the question I started with and the title of the talk, why should you consider certifying as a B Corp? I believe that the answer that the academic literature from across the past decade is pointing toward is essentially evidence that the primary utility of the certification is not necessarily in the potential for growth, but rather in the process itself, right? The process of raising awareness of stakeholder needs and of refining certifying organizations' responses to those needs. So I'll conclude there and pass it over to Alim.
Thank you so much, Professor Grimes. That's a great sort of quick overview of 10 years literature, which I think Dr. Alim Beveridge will continue further. But if I could summarize just 1 or 2 points from Professor Grimes' conversation or introduction about the topic, is that there's a bit of a tension, right? So at the same, on one hand, this B Corp certification have a short-term growth penalty. So the growth of these certified B firms might be a bit compromised, but it also allows them to authenticate and lock in the values. So companies that have the values could use this certification to lock in and authenticate that they have these values that they want to share with the world. So that's just a quick kind of capture from Professor Grimes. And I'm very pleased to welcome the next speaker, the second speaker, Dr. Alim Beveridge from University of Nottingham, Ningbo in China. The floor is yours, Alim.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel. Of course, it's a little bit intimidating to be presenting right after Matthew Grimes, but I will do my best. And what I would like to do is share aspects of this B Corporation phenomenon beyond the certification. So the certification, I think, is the most visible, best known aspect of this movement, really. And what I would like to share is how there's more to this. So that's why I've called my presentation More Than Meets the Eye, the movement behind the B Corporation certification. And so as you just saw from the previous presentation, the B Corp certification has become quite well known. It is very visible. There are over 4,000 certified B corporations in 77 countries around the world. And when people who know about this B Corporation phenomenon, the thing that they usually know about, that they will think of right away, is the certification. It's definitely the most visible aspect. But in fact, there is, of course, to the certification, there is a lot of, the process is quite involved and can be very illuminating and can lead to a lot of changes and a lot of, awareness raising, as Matthew was explaining. So that is a very powerful and meaningful process. But there's also other aspects of the movement which I think are quite important and fascinating, and are worthy of us knowing about and paying attention to. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a background story. The B Lab, of course, is the nonprofit based in the US that is behind the B Corp certification. And it was founded in 2006, as Yanto already mentioned. And there were 3 founders, Andrew Cassoy, Bart Houlihan, and Jay Cohen-Gilbert. And 2 of them, Houlihan and Gilbert, had previously been the founders and leaders of a basketball shoe company called And1. They founded the company in 1993. They were still very young. They were eager entrepreneurs wanting to launch a startup. They loved basketball. So they decided to start this basketball shoe company, and the company did very well. So over an 8-year period, it grew very quickly. And by the late 1990s, early 2000s, it was seeing about $250 million in annual revenue. And by some estimates, it was beginning to encroach on Nike's territory, reaching number 2 in the basketball basketball shoe market. And so, of course, Nike started paying attention to them and started fighting back. And so eventually they decided to sell it. But one thing that's very interesting about And1, this company that was run by these 2 of our founders, was that it was already engaged in a lot of what today we might call responsible business practices or corporate responsibility practices, when it wasn't yet so popular, and so there wasn't yet so much expectations on companies to be doing this. And it was still a small company, and right from the beginning, it was very focused on employee benefits. So it had lots of nice perks for employees, like yoga classes that on company grounds, a basketball court, organizing runs during lunchtime for people to stay fit, very very generous benefits for parental leave when someone was having a baby. And they were also very conscious of what's happening in their supply chain. They worked very closely with their suppliers. Some of them were based here in China, and they went out of their way to make sure that workers for those suppliers were being paid fair wages, that safety standards were being met, and they were quite strict about this. And they were also very generous about giving to local charities. So they were based in Pennsylvania, in the area of Philadelphia, and they gave about 10% of annual profits to various local charities that were focused on youth in urban areas, to try and develop youth leadership among urban youth, and also to develop education. Now, when they decided to sell the company in 2005, they sold it to a private shoe manufacturer, and within 6 weeks of the sale, all of these corporate responsibility or responsible business practices were canceled within 6 weeks of the sale. And in one interview, Bart Houlihan talks about it felt like losing a limb. Watching these programs get canceled by the new owners was like losing a limb. So I think this was, very much part of why these individuals decided to start B-Lab. As Matthew was explaining, it's a way to lock in values to make sure that they're not eroded, that they are preserved, that they're protected. And but more than that, it's not just a certification that B-Lab is using, I think, but some other approaches and strategies as well, which I would like to talk about. But more importantly, I think it's also important to keep in mind that B-Lab has a very ambitious mission. So if you look at their documents, you look at their statements, they have a very transformative vision. They talk about shifting towards an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system for all people and the planet. The reason I wanted to mention this is because the certification is often understood as a way to differentiate those companies that are truly committed to responsible and sustainable practices from those companies that are only saying that they're doing this. And that is true. That is an important function of the certification. But again, B-Lab has a much grander vision than that in mind, and I think it's worth knowing. And so, of course, they believe that business is an important player, has power, and this power should be used to achieve these very ambitious goals. And they very nicely state this in a document they published called the Declaration of Interdependence, which is a play on words, of course, of the Declaration of Independence. And their aim is to create a platform that supports companies that are committed to positive environmental impact. And they've taken this three-pronged approach, or if you will, there's three legs to the stool. One is building community and fostering learning. And I'll be giving some examples of that. Creating a supportive legal framework, and lastly, encouraging constant improvement. So much like you have your summit right now focused on social enterprise, the B-Lab organizes an annual retreat for B Corps to participate in. It's called the Champions Retreat. And it's a space over a period of 2-3 days. Leaders, representatives of various B Corps, most of them from the US and Canada, but also from other countries, come together to learn, to share, to encourage each other, and to discuss the future of the movement. But there's also, and so that is, of course, an example of something that is quite centralized. It's very much organized by B-Lab, and B-Lab plays a large role in how each one of those retreats, it unfolds. But in addition to that, B-Lab has been encouraging B corporations to form what are called B locals or B local chapters. And that is like a community of local B corporations that are situated in some area or region or city. Right now, there's 21 such B local chapters in North America, and they are mostly self-initiated and managed. So it is the B corporations in a particular city, like say Los Angeles or Miami or Philadelphia or Toronto, Vancouver, that decide that they want to do this. They get together, they form a B local, they inform B-Lab that they have created this B local, they establish some channels, but it's highly decentralized. It's very much something that the B Corps themselves are doing, and they determine the agendas of their meetings, they decide what they will focus on. And it's very much it aims to produce stronger ties between B Corps, and also to promote identification with the movement. Really to make B Corps, so to say, sign on to supporting the full movement, and not just B companies that have gained this certification and aren't doing anything with it. And they also play an ambassadorship role, where they introduce other companies to the certification, companies that might be interested, that might be curious, such as some of the people who are in the audience perhaps. They invite them to their meetings, they present the BIA, the assessment instrument that Matthew was talking about, and they try to encourage them to take it, even if they're not so sure about the certification. And then they help each other and give each other advice. Maybe exchange ideas on how to improve on the assessment, or how to change practices. And then lastly, a third approach to building community and fostering learning is, of course, the use of digital media. So B-Lab is very heavily invested in using social media to inform others about the certification and its goals and the movement. And it has also created an online community called Beehive, where B corporations can also communicate, interact, and learn from each other. And I think there's a very nice example of how B-Lab fosters learning in a more centralized way. So in 2017, B-Lab identified a very promising practice at one B corporation. This B corporation is called Rhino Foods. It's based in the state of Vermont in the United States. And they had introduced a program called Income Advance Program. And Rhino Foods developed this program in cooperation with a local credit union, basically a local bank. And when an employee has an emergency, some unplanned need, maybe they need a surgery, maybe someone in their family needs a surgery, maybe they need to pay off a significant debt, maybe their car needs a repair, et cetera, no questions asked, basically. The employee can ask for an emergency loan, and it's given to them that very day, in the up to $1,000. And then over the next months, that loan is repaid by taking a small portion of their weekly paycheck to pay it off. So B-Lab identified this as a very important way to create an environment that is more supportive of employees. The program has been very successful. Employees report being less stressed, more motivated, more focused. Their financial situation has improved. There's been less absenteeism at Rhino Foods. So working together, Rhino Foods and B-Lab created an income advance guide to encourage the rapid spread of the practice among other B corporations, and then used these various tools that I mentioned, the B Champions Retreat, the social media, to get the word out, to let other B Corps know about this practice, let them know about the availability of this resource so that they would avail themselves and hopefully adopt it. Now, the second leg of the stool, is creating a supportive legal framework. So Yanto mentioned in the beginning shareholder primacy. So there's a lot of concern in what we can call the Anglo-American system of corporate governance, which is what is dominant obviously in the US, also the UK, Australia. There's a concern that if a corporation is too focused on stakeholders, it might run into legal difficulties. In fact, there was an instance when Ben & Jerry's was faced with this issue. And so another part of the agenda of B-Lab is to introduce changes to corporate law in the United States. And they have done this through what is called benefit corporation legislation. Now, unfortunately, the term benefit corporation very often gets confused with the term B corporation because they sound almost exactly alike. So that is an unfortunate choice on their part. But here, benefit corporation refers to a change to corporate law. Basically, it defines a new legal corporate form, a corporation that is not only for profit, we might say. The purpose of this new legal corporate form is to pursue general public benefit or material positive impact on society and the environment. And the directors and managers are required to consider the impact of decisions that they make on non-shareholding stakeholders. And that is something that in the case of the United States has to be introduced at the state level, because each state of the 50 states has its own set of laws regarding corporate governance. And so B-Lab has been quite active in promoting the adoption of this new legislation on a state-by-state basis. Maryland was the first US state to adopt this legislation in 2010. Currently 35 states have adopted it, and the District of Columbia, Washington, DC has also adopted it. And there's also some other countries that have been in the process of adopting similar legislation. Italy, Colombia being some examples. Now, lastly, another aspect of this movement is that B-Lab is, I think, quite adamant about the need of any company that is serious about this to not simply rest on its laurels once it has achieved a B Corp certification, but to constantly seek to improve itself. And one way to do that, of course, is by requiring B corporations to recertify every 3 years. And if a B Corp doesn't do so, it will lose the right to the certification and the right to use the logo on its website, products, etc. In addition, the instrument, the BIA that Matthew was telling us about, is also updated every few years. There's an actual panel of experts who are in charge of updating it every 3 years. And as you can see from the graph, the average score of B Corps has been declining slightly with each version. And so there is some thought that each version is making it a little bit harder to get enough points to meet the minimum threshold of 80. And so that could be another way in which the lab is trying to raise the bar a little bit and encourage constant improvement. They also have these yearly awards. They call it Best for the World, and they list companies, B Corps, that they think are doing exceptionally well, recognize them in this way. And then they have something that is called the Inclusive Economy Challenge, which I'd like to tell you a little bit more about. This is an initiative that was first launched in 2016, and it is voluntary. It's open only to B Corps. And B Corps that want to participate need to choose 3 indicators from what is called the Inclusive Economy Metric Set. And they make a commitment to make improvements on these 3 indicators over a 1-year period. They may choose more than 3 if they want to, but most will choose only 3. And the Inclusive Economy Metric Set includes things like worker ownership, board diversity, paying living wages, allowing flexibility in work hours, primary caregiver leave, workforce diversity, healthcare for part-time workers, diversity inclusion training, et cetera, but also focus on environmental issues like measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And those B Corps that actually meet are able to at least achieve one goal by the end of the one-year period are then listed as inclusive economy changemakers. And then they've repeated this twice more, so there's been 3 rounds, and over the years, we can see a healthy number of B Corps participating. So 10%, about 10% of B Corps joined the first round, 175 of them, and 154 of those achieved at least one goal. And they didn't, of course, achieve all their goals. You know, they achieved about 46% collectively of the goals they had set. And interestingly, B Lab itself participated in the challenge, which I think is a nice way to set a good example. If you want to encourage others to do something, you do it yourself. In the second round, 174 B Corps participated, and this time a larger percentage of the goals were met. And you can see the majority of the goals in that round were definitely focused on workers, doing things that benefit the workers of the company or the employees of the company. And then the third round, about 200 B Corps participated, and about 140 of them achieved at least one goal. Now, in the last few years, they have not run this again. They have paused this initiative and are evaluating its impact and deciding how to move forward. But they have introduced a new initiative, which they call the SDG Action Manager, which was just launched or unveiled in January of this year, 2021. What they have done is they've taken the BIA, the tool or instrument that we've mentioned several times, and they've adapted it. They've removed some questions, added some new questions, so that companies can take this adapted tool to measure how they're doing against the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they've developed this tool by working together with the United Nations Global Compact. And the idea is to encourage companies, not just B Corps, any company, to take the SDGs seriously, to measure its performance against the SDGs, and also to figure out and learn how they can make improvements to help achieve the SDGs. We have now less than 10 years left to achieve the SDGs. The goals are to be met by 2030. And I think this is a very nice example of how B Lab is constantly introducing new things, evolving, so to say, the movement to try to meet new needs and challenges. So to conclude, what I was trying to get across, and I hope I've succeeded, is that there's more to B Corporation than just the certification. Of course, the certification is a very important and powerful aspect or component. It is in a movement. It aims to transform economies and the role of business in today's world. It also is a community of companies that share these goals and are trying to reach them, and by working together. It's also an identity. Obviously, again, as Matthew mentioned, not all companies are necessarily displaying the badge of honor, making that identity completely visible, but many corporations do very strongly identify with this label and with the movement. It is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. B Lab is constantly trying to keep an eye on what's happening in the world and what needs there are, and trying to adapt the movement to respond to those. But lastly, I do want to point out, sometimes these things can seem a little bit intimidating, and some companies might say, this is a lot more than I'm looking for. And so certainly it should be noted that it can be just a certification if a company wants it to be. So there's no obligation ever for a company that decides to get certified to participate in any of these other things that I mentioned. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alim. That was a nice brief sketch of a couple of key points about B Corp, from the history of the founding of the B Lab to a very interesting case. You talk about Rhino Foods that provides emergency loan to employees, which reminds us in Asia the values of family businesses, in which the owner and the employees are almost like treated like a family, and helping each other, and also to the movements to introduce a more like a legislation framework for companies that want to really go beyond just a certification. And overall, it also shows that B Corp is a very dynamic movement, and a lot of things are changing and very interesting progress. So last but not least, we have here on the ground Ms. Ada Yip. who's a real business practitioner, and her company, Urban Springs, has been certified as a B Corp a couple of years ago, right? Without further ado, let's welcome Ada to take over. Thanks.
Yeah, we got it last year, so thank you. Thank you. It's 6 o'clock here in Hong Kong, so you probably are ready to go home or have a drink now. So thank you for staying with us. So bear with me for hopefully 10-15 minutes. I do want to share our journey with you. Hope you get excited. We are, one of the homegrown companies in Hong Kong. We got B Corp certification. And actually, we are one of the few which do actually physical product. I think most of the other B Corp in Hong Kong, they're service companies, which is probably not surprising to you, given our infrastructure. So maybe to start with is to tell you a little bit more, just in case some of you actually don't know Urban Spring, Seng Chun. So what we do is to tackle the problem of single-use plastic bottles. This is our vision statement. We think that the world can do without much less plastic bottles. And how do we do that is by building a reliable network of water refill stations. So I'll explain that a little bit later. So the problem, so today, we are probably 30 minutes, 40 minutes down an hour almost of the session. Globally, 1 million single-use plastic bottles get consumed every minute. So by now, it's already 60 million globally. So here in Hong Kong, every day, we consume more than 3 million, just water bottles. If you count everything else, it's probably around 6 million. So we decided to tackle the problem of water bottles because it's this majority of the beverage bottles. And there's definitely an alternative because we have very good tap water here in Hong Kong. With the filter, you are able to get your water and hydrate. It's not just a landfill problem. The microplastic is getting into our food system, in our water. So it's very imminent. But if we all know plastic is so bad, why are we still buying? And if you go to a supermarket any day today or convenience store, you will still see a big chunk of the refrigerator will be filled with different brands of water, bottled water, all over the world, from France, from Fiji, from everywhere. So why? I guess with these photos, explains, because even if you are very green, you carry your own bottle, you cannot find a network. Even if you can find a water refill, it's probably not very attractive. You don't trust the water. So what we try to do is to really get people to rethink what a water refill should be. We build a network so that people are comfortable and feel that they are getting safe drinking water. So showing you a couple of pictures of where we have these water stations. Right now, we have more than 400 across the city. They're in shopping malls, in hotels, gyms, and also more important, it's in schools, primary, secondary schools, university, in co-working space, etc. Country parks as well. But so much more we need to we need to do because probably a few of you actually have not seen our water stations yet. So our journey, the company is set up for 6 years now. It is a product that we design and produce. So we actually launched our product in 2017. So now it's just over 3 years. We got our B Corp certification last year. So the history, it's actually back in 2017, I started to go on the website and do the assessment. Just really purely with the intention of just knowing how extensive the assessment is, because if you go to the assessment basically is free, so anyone can go to do it. And also as part of my journey to build the company, I want to really look at the different aspects that I should be really considering as I build out the different operations and how we are set up. So at that point, I think I got the score, obviously unaudited score, probably around 70. But to be honest, I was thinking my product it hasn't matured, my operations hasn't matured. It doesn't make sense for me to go through the assessment. So 3 years down the road, we have also done our product life cycle assessment. We thought that we're ready, so that's why we went ahead last year. We actually submitted in the beginning of 2020. It took 6 months for B Corp to, they have got actually a long queue for people wanting to be assessed. So it took 6 months. And then with the interview and also subsequent submitting the documentation, it took us another sort of 2 to 3 months. So at the end of last year, we got our certification. So why B Corp? Actually, Matthew, I would echo, I guess, what you said earlier about the motivation. I'm motivated to do that. I mean, given not a lot of people actually know about B Corp. So does it really help me in terms of business development? Not really. So, but we, but I think the fortunate thing is I got to know about the B Corp's concept quite a number of years ago. I believed in it. As I feel that the company grows, I want to make sure that not just the cause, the mission that we do, but how we operate, how we organize ourselves, how I treat our employees and all that are being taken care of, so that it provides a framework for me to really monitor my organization. So in the spirit of being transparent, I'm going to show you my scores. Actually, a little bit further down, I'll show you all my scores in the different areas. So I hope actually I would share some examples of what I do good, very well in terms of scores, and what I do not do very well, so that it gives you some context. And also, more importantly, the opportunity to improve in the future. So when I originally submitted this, my unaudited self-assessment is about 98. So with all the auditing and all the questioning, it came down. Luckily, I still passed, so I'm still a B Corp. So later on, there's some slides. You look at the end, you see the different colors. The text is a bit small, but you don't have to worry about, I guess, the words. The colors is to basically, B Corp would tell you how you benchmark against other B corporation in your country, in your sector, and also your size. Because actually, if you're in different industry, you're different size, you actually get different sets of questions. Okay, so I'll quickly go through the different aspects. First on the community. So again, don't worry about reading all this. So you just see the colors and how I compare across industries and similar organizations. So in this category on community, in total 42. So in total, I answer over 200 questions. So for community, it's around 42 questions. So what I do better, it's around the community, which is on the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they will be asking you questions about, for example, your ownership structure. So how diverse is the people who own your company? Are they local people? And also how diverse is your management team? So as detailed as, how many people in the management team, how many were women, how many are from ethnic minorities. They even ask you about when we say high-low pay ratio, you have to submit and tell them the highest paid person, how much, and the lowest paid person. And then the other thing is on supplier. So it's not just limited to asking diversity of me, but also my supplier and also their policies and programs as well. The part that I do not do very well, it's around the economic impact. So these are questions around, say, so here when I have got the tech is the part that I do better. The half circle is where I do okay. So in this case is whether I have got a good sort of purchasing, local purchasing policies. The part that I'm not doing so well is around sourcing. So the constraint here, it's basically, it's not just about, getting, good components from a certain purchaser, right? It actually asks you to tell, it asks me to tell them exactly, who are my suppliers, the type of suppliers that I'm from, whether they're local, and also whether they have got policy. You can imagine it is quite difficult because it's not just good enough that whether the suppliers have got good practices. I actually have to provide evidence that they actually have policies in place. So I think the question here, I think there were some pre-submit questions about the impact or, how we're solving global problem. One aspect I think is on the supply chain issues, whether it's from human rights to whether it's how environmental your supply is. So through these questions, these 50 questions, some of them I do better, some of them I don't do very well. Those are actually, it actually gives me indicators how I can improve in the future. So it helps me to basically design my future supply chain and procurement processes. On environment, because we produce a physical product, so this is a very intensive section. So I imagine if it is a service company, it's much lower, much fewer questions. This is a very interesting score here, because if you look at water, given we are a water business, we actually score 0. Okay, why? It's because these are around questions of my operations, whether my water in the office get recycled, whether I've got water efficiency system in place. Also, it asks questions about the water efficiency of the factory that I produce my products. So again, it's areas that actually I don't have much control. So that's why I score a 0. So, but this is just to give you an example that it is quite an extensive assessment of the different aspect of one's operations. So luckily, we did a life cycle assessment of a product. So what does that mean? It's so you can imagine the fancy water station that I have. People were asking that, how much carbon emission do you produce? Do I produce, right? So so we actually go to a third party to get that independent assessment of how. So whatever the environmental impact that we report today is actually net our own negative impact. And then I think very quickly, probably I should go quickly. So the other aspect on impact is not just about, the question is not just about how we produce. There is a lot of questions around what we're doing for the community and how we're contributing to the overall environmental impact and also on education. So the fact that we are data-driven, we are IoT, we're actually collecting information about water usage, the amount of plastic we're saving, it helps a lot in terms of producing those reports. It's not just quantitative, a lot of it is also qualitative questions around whether we have got education awareness programs. So we do in schools, which is a big part, so that helps. This is the happy photo that I always share, because I think for us, it indicates our mission vision is not just about numbers, dollar amount or the number of people. I think it's about how we're changing or attempt to change behavior. Customers, this is an area which is not a lot of questions. So it's questions around data privacy, quality assurance, and making sure that we actually collect feedback from customers about how we do in customer survey. So again, it's not just quantity, but also qualitative feedback. Governance, so quite obvious, governance is around questions around diversity of our board, whether we have got good policy and procedures in place. How often do we not just have a meeting, but do we assess our impact? etc. Workers, this is about employees. So again, this is an area which is quite intensive, 49 questions, not just how much you pay and whether you pay the minimum wage, but also around the well-being, whether you have got enough insurance coverage, etc., as well as career development for the employees. So again, I think here, this is definitely an area that we are very focused on career development. So this is an area that we score pretty well. So I guess I'm going to stop here so that we can go to panel discussions, but I'll do a plug here because I think, us is just providing a product and a service to enable all of us to reduce at source. But I think it is important that all of you sort of participate and make this happen.
Thank you so much, Ida. That's a lovely sharing about their experience in getting the certification and going through the process. So it was, how long was the process from the first time you start filling in the questionnaire till the time you get the certification?
It's sort of a year, because but there was a 6 month sort of waiting time.
Sure,
you know.
Sure. Okay, great. So we have heard a lot and learned a lot. So we're going to open the floor to questions. Questions. Let's welcome questions. Anybody on the floor here or online? I see something on the chat line, but I can't click on it.
Okay, thank you very much for the very insightful sharing. Just one question around, the why we want to become a B Corp. I think B Corp, they make a decision not to using the conventional metrics to make a difference to the world. So from the academic point of view, shall we develop a new set of metrics to convince companies to become B Corp rather than using the traditional, conventional, shareholder-driven metrics? So for example, GDP. I mean, GDP no longer represents the well-being of the country. So shall we, as an academic, shall we develop a new set of metrics? So for example, something like contribution to a SDG impact, something like that, rather than using the shareholder value to convince the community.
Okay, anybody like to take the questions? Professor Grimes or Beveridge?
Sure. I mean, I think as I'm sure all of us in the room can attest, it's not easy to measure these things, right? And this is one of the reasons why I think we as a global society have defaulted to the things that are easiest to measure. But at the same time, I think we are making progress, and I think academics have certainly been a part of that conversation. Do I think that we could do more in this regard? Absolutely. I think where I'm seeing most of the innovation coming from in terms of measurements is from places like B Lab, who are really pushing this forward and revising these metrics over time, experimenting with different metrics, challenging companies to get rigorous about quantifying these things. I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, I mean, what we measure is what we become. And so this is an incredibly important conversation. And I think it's also important to recognize that, quantitative measures can be dangerous if those measurements are not, if those measurements do not evolve over time, right? And are not reflecting of diverse voices, right? I mean, to the extent that academics in their ivory tower are building out these metrics, but we're decoupled from the actual, practices on the ground, I think that could be detrimental to the effort. So it's really a cross-sectoral effort that we need, and it needs to be a democratic effort in some regards, right? It needs to be built from hearing from bottom-up voices about what's working, what's not working. But absolutely, academics should be a part of that conversation as well. So thank you for that question.
Yep, I thought that's a rather normative questions. Should we or should we not? I think it's a long conversation for that, but thanks, Professor Grimes. So there are other questions here, urgent questions, which is saying that B Corp is very much kind of a Western style metrics or measurements. Can I see the other screen? Okay, so the idea is B Corp is a Western style measurements. Do we need to have a regional kind of like maybe something that is a measurement for these 4 or 5 dimensions that we talk about: customer, competitor, employees, and environment and community? Whether we need this kind of measurements that are kind of like at the regional level, or kind of like more targeted for the regions, for Asian regions. So that's the question. I don't know whether Alim or Matthew or Ada would like to take the question. Now I can see it.
Maybe yeah. I'll start. Maybe I'll start as a practitioner, I guess. I don't know. I guess I don't know how to define my style, but I guess even within Asia, there are different countries and different culture. But if I sort of rewind in terms of the type of questions or the types of so-called matrix that the B assessment consists of, I don't personally feel that there was a lot of, I don't think it's very culture sensitive. No, what I mean is not biased to certain management style or certain culture. There are probably just a couple of questions which might be a little bit American-centric, because it talks about some minimum wage and insurance coverage, which is not exactly the type of structure that we're in. But actually, recently I participated in their survey about that, looking into actually the new set of questions, every 3 years, and I participated, and there was a forum basically for each region to voice comments on the assessment. So I thought that was quite transparent and quite open. So as a person who participated, I didn't feel that it was. I think it's still very relevant, and I think in particular, if for countries they are hoping to work across region. And I think the beauty of being a B Corp is when I meet someone who's a B Corp, I don't have to explain that much. You're a B Corp, then I already know sort of what you are under. So it's almost, we don't have to explain that much about how we operate. So in that sense, it actually helps to just glue people together.
Very nice answer. I think we'll just move on because there's so many questions here. The next question is talking about the differences between B Corp certification and ESG. Does Alim or Matthew would like to take the question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the ESG has become very popular now, and there's a lot of focus on how to best measure it, and there's the competing frameworks. And in some ways, I think you can consider the BIA to be another framework, another approach to measuring environmental, social, and governance impacts of companies. It was obviously designed specifically originally for companies that want to become B Corp certified, but there have been attempts to use it for other purposes. As I mentioned, the SDG Action Manager is a very recent attempt to adapt the BIA so that companies can measure how they're doing against the 17 UN SDGs. Previously, there was another attempt, it was called GEARS, and B-Lab was trying to offer the BIA as an instrument that can be used by investors to measure the ESG aspects of potential investments, and basically let that guide them in their decision making and how to invest their money. and with a particular focus on offering this to investors who are interested in socially responsible investing or impact investing. So I think in some ways you could say that this is another approach to ESG, but with a specific purpose.
All right, thank you so much, Alim. And there's a next question asking whether B Corp produces greater social impact compared to conventional commercial enterprises. That sounds like something like Matthew could answer. Can I say so?
Sure, you can say so. Whether or not I can is another question. I mean, it's a really important question, and I think it's one of the things that I've wrestled with across the last decade as I've thought about this research that we're doing, which in so many ways carves out a distinctive space for these organizations that claim to be social enterprises, right? So it's these organizations are making an identity claim. They're saying we are different in kind. And so we treat them differently because they make these claims, but not necessarily because post hoc we've measured whether or not they've actually produced the impact that they've claimed to produce. And conversely, we're also ignoring the potential benefits that commercial enterprises have created as well. I think in some ways this is precisely what the B impact assessment is trying to get past, is rather than just who's making claims about being beneficial to society, let's start to get serious about auditing this. And so whether or not it's ESG, or whether or not we're talking about the BIA impact assessment as a kind of a subdomain of the ESG measurement, I think getting rigorous around governance, getting rigorous around measurement is how we actually start to answer that question that you posed here. So the evidence, we don't really have strong evidence to suggest one way or the other, but I would venture to say there are probably conditions under which social enterprises have produced greater harm than, for example, conventional commercial enterprises, or commercial enterprises have produced greater impact than social enterprises. Now, we just don't have the data and the evidence to help answer that question precisely, but my guess is there are likely conditions under which we would see that to be true. So certainly more opportunities for research in that area, and to not just take at face value what the organizations are claiming they're doing, but rather getting serious about auditing their impact. But a very good question.
Yep, it's a very good question. Actually, it's still an empirical question that is yet to be answered. Any comments from Ada?
Yeah, I would very much agree with that, because I mean, you can have a social enterprise say their product services is to address a elderly, issue, but they can be very bad to their employees. Right. So I guess to me, it's a holistic approach to sort of look at least you meet some very basic requirement all rounded around your accountability in different areas. So yes, I would agree that it's not, I don't think there's a long enough or big enough data to justify, but I think there's certainly also cases where social enterprise doesn't mean that it's producing bigger impact.
I'm quite intrigued by the presentation by Professor Grimes. Initially, when he presented the empirics of this studies of hundreds of B Corps, particularly in North America, they found that there is a short-term penalty for growth for companies that have been certified as B Corp, which means that perhaps normally they grow at 15%, but after they get a certification, they grow at slower pace, maybe at 5% or few lower. So is that sort of like, I mean, that leads to, whether there are any intended or unintended consequence of having the certification. Is that slower growth kind of like anticipated or intended or unintended, or are there anything else that companies need to know before they even think about wanting to jump into this bandwagon called B Corp certification? Would Alim or Matthew?
Maybe I'll definitely let, I'm sure the academics is more stronger sort of evidence or research, but me as a practitioner, I definitely agree again. I mean, short term, you know, I spent 30 hours, say, on the certification. I could just go out and get more business, right? So I might compromise my short-term growth, but I would say the key word there is short-term. I do this, it's because I want to build a good, healthy company, a sustainable company. So the whole point of doing it is the onset. I make sure I set the framework early, right? So that whoever else comes in, it sort of follow that good foundation. So that's my motivation. In terms of how much that the growth is, I don't know. But at the same time, although earlier I mentioned about that holistic scoring of many fronts, but again, I don't need to high above average of the 200 questions, right? There are areas that I can improve over time. Because for example, even I've done my product lifecycle assessment, it doesn't mean that, can I claim that my water station is the greenest water station out there? No, there's still a lot of opportunities for me to improve. But again, if I aim to be the greenest product, I can never start my business, you know. So there's always this, you know, it sort of move along the journey. But the whole point is, you know, I certainly want to get recertified, because that's how I get measured whether I improve over time.
Okay, great. I was told that we have 5 minutes left. Any questions from audience? There's one here.
Very much for the insights. That's very interesting, especially for Matthew's point on locking in the value. I think the analogy in my head is, some people, to keep fit, they need a gym membership. So maybe B Corp, the certification, serve that purpose. But I think just to would be good, Matthew, to get a few examples on what are the elements to the short-term penalty. Is it just because founders or the organization, they have less time for business development, as Ada said, or would there be other examples as well? And then maybe one question to Ada as well. You mentioned that, I don't know whether it's just that you spend 30 hours or 6 months to fill in the survey. It sounds to me it's really laborious. I just wonder how you see the future of certification for B Corp. Would there be a smarter way to achieve that? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So the article that you're referring to about the short-term penalty, I mean, this was published in the Academy of Management Discoveries, which is kind of it's a journal in our field, which is set up to kind of publish data for which we don't have a lot of clear theory around exactly why the effects are happening the way they are. And so your question speaks to that, right? And one of the things that the authors hypothesized was that, you know, exactly what you referenced, which is perhaps this penalty is associated with the time investment, right? I mean, as Ada noted, this is a rigorous investment of time. And if you're a small company, you're a vulnerable company with limited resources, you're already stretched thin. The capacity to develop this and build it out, you know, there's a cost investment. But in addition, I think as well, there is the other mechanism here potentially is around orienting firms toward a different set of end goals to which they are optimizing, right? So if you're optimizing towards growth, well, maybe that the energy and investment towards growth is going to compel that growth. But if you're optimizing towards impact, and impact is not necessarily the same as growth, well, in that case, you might actually have a short-term penalty associated with growth. Now, we would expect, I think, that if we measured this over time, perhaps over the long term, that orientation toward impact would make for more resilient companies, such that, you know, you're able to respond to the dynamics of a complex environment, and therefore be more resilient across crisis, for example, as opposed to those organizations that have purely focused on a narrow set of growth metrics. So we just don't have enough data to look at this over the longer term. But that would be my suspicion, is that it's not just about the time investment, but about where organizations are trying to focus and optimize, and therefore the results that has on growth.
So on the question of the sort of amount of time and effort, I think it's worth it, because I guess you need to basically identify the right person within the organization to basically own that process. I mean, although I'm the CEO, I'm very close to the operations, because it's still a young company. So it's about building the different standards of the operations, right? From business development to operation servicing to human resources. So to some extent, I feel that although I'm investing that X number of hours, but actually it is providing for a framework for me to think about, how to build the organization, now or in the future. So it's not the absolute 30 hours that I could have gone out to get business, because at the same time, it actually helps me to build the operations. So I think it's reasonable. And when we go through the audit and the questions, again, I thought the supporting document that we need to submit is also reasonable. It's not too stringent in my mind. So I thought it's okay.
Okay, great. There's another question asking whether we need rankings for social enterprises. Now universities are being ranked, journals are being ranked. The question is about whether social enterprises need to be ranked, and whether we are ready to rank social enterprises, or is it still premature? I don't think we have any ranking for social enterprises in Hong Kong yet, and we do have some sort of endorsement for social enterprise called Social Enterprise Endorsement Mark, SE Mark, and in the UK they have a CIC, kind of like a legal structure for social enterprises. But I don't know, ranking. Do we need ranking? Alim or?
That's a great question, actually, and I mean, I don't know if I have a direct answer. I think it is obviously worth it to have some way to recognize social enterprises when they are doing exceptionally well in meeting whatever goals or objectives they have defined, when they remain true to their mission, they don't suffer the mission drift that Matthew was talking about. So I think there's value in having something to recognize social enterprises with, and obviously the right criteria would be needed for that. As I mentioned, B-Lab does that with the Best for the World Awards. So it has an, I've heard actually one of the founders of B-Lab talk about how there's been other parties that have approached B-Lab and asked B-Lab to create some type of a ranking, or if you will, like levels, like gold level, platinum level, silver level, similar to LEED, to further differentiate, one B Corp from another. And they have resisted that. But instead, what they do is they have these annual recognitions, which they call Best for the World. So, so I think it is good to have a way to recognize social enterprises. At the same time, I think personally, I think a ranking might be too extreme, and it would be hard to find some universal criteria that could be used to develop a fair ranking.
Okay, so to be honest, I think there's no clear yes or no answer to the need for ranking. Do you have other questions from the audience here? Maybe I think there's no more questions online. Maybe just one last question from the audience here, if there is. Okay, one last question. Great. Hopefully that's a good one.
Thank you very much for the sharing. And I just want to ask, because a lot of social enterprise in Hong Kong is a bit, it's small and medium sized. So unlike a lot of bigger social enterprises that they can allocate resources to apply for a B Corporation, is there any advice for social enterprises in Hong Kong regarding to this?
advise whether they should certify? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe Ada?
I think there are representatives of the B Lab office here, so you can ask. They have support for those who are interested to know more. But I think that you also have to bear in mind the size of your company actually determine how many questions and how much work is involved. So when I did the assessment 5 years ago, it's much fewer questions because it depends on how many employees, how much turnover, etc. So it's sort of correlated, the amount of work. So I wouldn't be, I guess, too worried about it. I mean, just go online and basically do a pre-assessment. It's free. It will give you some idea, right? It can spill up maybe just 50 questions or 200 questions. I don't know the type, the company that you're in, but give it a try.
Okay, thank you. I think that's conclude our academic forum on B Corp for this year. Thank you so much. I look at the clock, it's 6:45 p.m. and you guys all are very enthusiastic, and thank you for all being here and supporting us. And also great thanks to our great speakers, Professor Matthew Grimes from Cambridge, Dr. Alan Beveridge from Nottingham, Ningbo, and Ada from Urban Springs. Thank you so much for all of you. Hopefully we'll meet again and in maybe in the future events on B Corp or related topics. Thank you. Bye-bye.